India and China are locking horns, and the wake of the rivalry is expanding throughout Asia. As India passes China to become the world's most populous country, the power dynamic is shifting beyond Beijing. Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi, two men leading their countries to greatness, have become locked in a frozen conflict that has, in some areas, gone hot. India isn't just growing demographically, it's growing economically, and that could lead to military growth as well. China, on the verge of becoming a global superpower, has little room to maneuver. As either side competes for influence in Central and South Asia, it's clear that India controls key areas that can deeply threaten China's interests. This is the Cold War in Asia, a Cold War that few in the West pay attention to, but one that could shape the later half of the 21st century. A century once believed to be China's century, but is quickly becoming the century of chaos instead. This story starts with India's recent growth. India sits on a geostrategically important area, with easy geographic access to the Indian Ocean. Despite this, India's development has been slow, picking up in recent years, but still below its potential. India has had success in targeting poverty. However, its impoverished population, largely arrayed in rural areas, is still the largest impoverished population living in a single country globally. This has impacts on military development. India has one of the largest militaries in the world, with 1.5 million active duty personnel and over 1.1 million reserve personnel. Their military also possesses a capable navy, commissioning their first domestically produced aircraft carrier, the INS Vikrant, in September 2022. India also maintains a nuclear triad, meaning they're capable of deploying and launching nuclear weapons via land, air, and sea-based platforms. This matches the nuclear triads also possessed by China and Pakistan, two regional rivals of New Delhi. India has invested in further developing its military as well, procuring weapon systems from several countries. It's this area where we see India's first challenge in their growth and ability to compete with China longer term. India has sought new weapon systems from wherever they can find and afford them, including from Russia and the West. India's procurement of Russian gear is worth up to $13 billion in the last 5 years alone. India accounts for 20% of Russia's weapon exports. They also maintain close ties with Russia and, paradoxically, China via the BRICS Economic Partnership. India recently announced a massive defense procurement plan worth $8.5 billion, with nearly all of the procurement coming from Indian-based companies. A large share of this procurement will go towards growing and modernizing the Indian Navy, granting it a greater ability to strike targets at distance with additional BrahMos cruise missiles. As India further develops, China's eyes in Central and South Asia begin to shift south. While India and China have a history of conflicts that have stagnated from both hot and cold, particularly in the Himalayas, India's rise could threaten Chinese interests beyond Ladakh. Southeast of India is the Malacca Strait, a narrow passage that connects China with the rest of the world. 70% of China's imported oil passes through this strait, with 25% of global trade also making the trek. It's this region where India could potentially expand a conflict with China, choking Chinese oil imports and imposing great costs to the Chinese economy. Both countries have invested heavily in their navies. With India's launching of the first aircraft carrier, China has launched 3 of their own. That said, China's maritime interests span far beyond just the Malacca Strait. China has spent a great deal of time and effort focused on the invasion of Taiwan. Whether that actually happens is another story. However, China has nevertheless invested heavily on the capability to do so should they want to. This matters because those are capabilities that China can use in the Malacca Strait as well. However, they also will have limited ability to handle conflicts in both areas simultaneously. With India's modernizing and growing navy, the forces China will have to send to match India over the Malacca Strait will grow as well. Instead of deploying one single aircraft carrier to gain a decisive advantage, they instead may have to use up to all 3, which leaves a conflict over Taiwan or in other areas without a key naval capability. This will also have consequences in China's ability to support their 4 deployed forces in Africa, namely in the well-known base in Djibouti, but also their new and permanent base in Equatorial Guinea. If India cuts off the Chinese Navy through the Malacca Strait, China would have to bypass south through the Sunda Strait or further south near Indonesia. This costs China time and fuel, and if crises emerge in Africa that involve their overseas postings, time will be what China can least afford to lose. The maritime domain gets more complicated when you factor in the Maldives, which is a small island island nation in the middle of the Indian Ocean. While it has a strong history with India, its recent history began to shift towards China for economic projects and support. China has provided substantial economic aid to the Maldives in the forms of grants, soft loans, and development projects. In 2017, China pledged $3.6 billion in investment and aid to the Maldives. China has also financed and constructed several major infrastructure projects in the Maldives, including a new runway for the Valana International Airport, the Sinamale Bridge, and the China-Maldives Friendship Bridge. India has been attempting to counter Chinese influence in the Maldives, which it views as part of its traditional sphere of influence. They've invested in the Maldives in a number of ways, such as through the provision of vaccines, infrastructure development, and tourism. India has also sought to strengthen its military ties with the Maldives, with the two countries signing a defense cooperation agreement in 2016. One specific example of India's efforts to counter Chinese influence in the Maldives is the construction of the Greater Malay Connectivity Project. India has also been working to improve its diplomatic ties with the Maldives, and has provided financial and technical assistance to help the country develop its democratic institutions. To the north, Sri Lanka has undergone significant economic challenges, but has sought help from both China and India. China, however, has been hesitant to completely commit aid. The current situation suggests that Chinese influence in Sri Lanka has both strengths and weaknesses. On one hand, China has made significant investments in Sri Lanka's infrastructure, including the construction of the Colombo port city, which is expected to be a major hub for international business in the future. On the other hand, Sri Lanka's recent economic and political crises has put a dent in Chinese influence, as Sri Lanka has had to seek help from the International Monetary Fund rather than China. Additionally, Sri Lanka has been cautious in accepting Chinese investments in recent years, as seen in the rejection of a $1.5 billion loan from China. Sri Lanka's economic crisis has provided an opportunity for India to push back against China's growing influence in the region. However, anti-Indian sentiments persist among sections of the Sri Lankan population due to suspicions and fears about Indian hegemony. The crisis in Sri Lanka has also created a humanitarian crisis, which could impact India directly due to its proximity. India has committed significant resources to Sri Lanka for rehabilitation and the relief of Tamils in the country. India has also stepped up exports of engineering goods and services alongside investments in key infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka to counter China's growing influence in the region. Meanwhile, China has invested heavily in infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka, which has exacerbated the economic crisis in the country. These are all key concerns for New Delhi. However, the Cold War between China and India spans across the north of India as well. In the Himalayas is a region called Ladakh, where India and China have engaged in both hot and cold conflicts throughout the past century. The most recent conflict between the two countries started in May 2020, along the line of actual control. The conflict has resulted in casualties on both sides, with troops engaging in physical brawls and skirmishes. The conflict is still going to this day. In September 2021, shots were fired by both sides for the first time in 45 years, with China accusing India of firing shots at its troops and India accusing China of firing shots into the air. This incident marked a significant escalation in the ongoing conflict. One of the deadliest conflicts between India and China occurred in June 2020 in the Galwan Valley region of Ladakh. The conflict resulted in the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers and an unknown number of Chinese soldiers. This was the first deadly conflict between the two countries in the last 45 years. It is also worth noting that India and China have a long history of border disputes and have engaged in several conflicts prior to this. The conflicts range from minor skirmishes to full-scale wars, such as the 1962 Sino-Indian War, in which India suffered a humiliating defeat. This isn't the only part of the Indian border that has seen fighting. In the northwest, India and Pakistan have rivaled for the province of Kashmir. The two countries have fought 3 wars over the region, in 1947 through 48, in 1965, and again in 1999. India and Pakistan both claim the region in full, but only control parts of it, which are recognized internationally as the Indian-administered and Pakistan-administered sections. An armed revolt has been waged against Indian rule for 3 decades, with tens of thousands killed. India revoked the special status of Indian-administered Kashmir on August 5, 2019, which created further apprehension. There have been numerous attempts at peace talks and negotiations over the years, but the conflict remains unresolved. China has been a longtime ally and supporter of Pakistan in the ongoing conflict over Kashmir. In October 2019, in a meeting with then Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan, Chinese President Xi Jinping expressed support support for Pakistan on issues related to its core interests in Kashmir. Xi's statement was widely seen as a boost of Pakistan's position in the Kashmir issue. China's support for Pakistan on the Kashmir issue was also heightened during the fourth round of the Pakistan-China Strategic Dialogue, held in Islamabad in May 2023. The two sides issued a joint statement in which China mentioned that the Kashmir conflict between India and Pakistan was a holdover from the history that should be resolved as per the UN resolutions while avoiding any unilateral action. Moreover, in August 2019, China had stated that it would support Pakistan in defending its, quote, legitimate rights and interests in the Kashmir crisis. The United States has been actively involved in managing tensions between India and China, given its strategic interest in the Indo-Pacific. The US has taken several steps to deepen its strategic ties with India, such as the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, or BECA, that enables real-time access to American geospatial intelligence and placing India at the center of its ambition to detach global supply chains from American adversaries. However, the US-China rivalry may stoke conflict with India along the border, and the situation has implications for the US and its Indo-Pacific strategy. This competition, combined with tensions between India and China, created a complex geopolitical situation in the Indo-Pacific. The Cold War between India and China can shape the 21st century, and yet it's often forgotten. While the US-China rivalry makes headlines, India plays a key role in countering Chinese interests in Central Asia. For China to truly become a superpower, they need to make it past India, and with tensions along the border in Ladakh and Kashmir, stagnating economies, and nationalist leadership, there are clear paths for escalation. This region isn't just the world's most populous, it's the world's most dangerous, with 3 nuclear powers involved in this Cold War. If this video was helpful or informative, hit the like button. It really helps out this channel. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Until next time.